Alright guys, welcome to RC Mojo. This week we've got the wheel arches, tyre rack and some spring-loaded legs to be getting on with. So without further delay, let's have the bag Mark 7 and 8 opened up and tipped into a pot. There's loads of screws and nuts in there, plus 2 rubber squares for the mud flaps. There's the 2 top plates for the wheel arches. These feel more like an acrylic sheet rather than the plastic we normally end up with in RC kits. It looks very nicely cut, but that paper backing is going to be a bit of a fiddle to remove. It will tear if we're not extremely careful. A plastic backing is much nicer to use. As is customary, since the 2 wheel arches are essentially the same, the only difference being which end the rubber mud flap goes, we will just build one on the video to save the repetition. Right then, from the parts trees. 2 P4s, which are part of the chassis mount, 2 P3s, the end bits, and a P1, the side panel. For the screws, there's 3 2x5mm, 4 M3x20s, 8 M3x10s, 4 3x8 self-tappers, 2 M3x12s, and we'll need 14 M3 flange nuts, but we'll get those out as we go. That just leaves one bit of plastic I missed, E10, the backing plate to mount the rubber mud flaps. Before we can start putting all these bits together, we need to peel the paper backing off the acrylic sheet. Start in one corner and work your way across. Where the holes are, the paper can catch and tear, so we need to be extremely careful so we can attempt to get it peeled off in one piece. The holes along the side are just as bad. Don't be tempted to keep peeling, clean up the little tears as you go. Having said all that, it does tend to get annoying a bit fast. Keep peeling and clean up anything that's left. One thing though, the plastic underneath is rather nice. Right, assembly time. First we need to attach the little P4s to the end plates, P3. They fit over the channels moulded into the lugs. Attached with 3x8mm self-tappers, what we end up with is 2 holes that face the chassis for mounting screws. Quite a neat way to save a lot of money on the moulds. To fit everything to the top plate, we need to install the M3 screws in the holes. In the corners we need M3x12s, everywhere else we need M3x10s. All the plastic bits have slots rather than closed holes, so we can install the nuts a few turns and get everything into position. Slide one of the end plates in, and while holding the nuts underneath, lightly nip up the 2 screws at the back, leaving the longer ones. We need them just enough to stop everything falling apart. Next the side panels go on, P1. Slide into position and nip up the middle 2 screws and nuts, followed by the outer 2. A little way down the end panels there's another hole that lines up with a slot in the side panels. These need M3x10s and nuts, and just like the others, just lightly nip them up. Now while the screws are very lightly done up, we can go around and make sure everything's nice and square and lined up. It will just need a bit of a push and a shove. When it all looks good, go around and lock tight and tighten up each screw one by one. The mud flaps have 3 holes punched in on one edge. We need to remove the little round bits before we can fit them. If you fold the rubber, they normally pop out all by themselves. The backing plate, E11, has 3 raised bits around the holes on one side. The holes in the mud flap fit over them perfectly, so when we fit the rubber it won't be squashed, but it will be properly supported. Very nice. The side with the bumps goes up against the end plate on the wheel arches. Which end depends on which side the wheel arch is going to be fitted. It's held on with 3 2x5mm screws. These are small machine screws going into plastic, so we need to take extra care not to over tighten them and strip the threads. For the second mud flap, make sure you fit it to the other end of the second wheel arch. The easiest way to make sure is to lay the 2 arches side by side with the mounting lugs towards each other. Make sure both flaps end up to the rear of the chassis. Last bit for step 7 then, mounting the complete arches. We'll need 8 long screws, M3x20s, and 8 M3 flange nuts. It might have been nice if the holes in the chassis were M3 tapped. I'm thinking once everything else gets mounted it's going to be a bit tricky to reach the nuts to remove them. Anyway, the screws go through the lugs on the ends of the arches and pass through some holes in the chassis. We need to fit a flange nut on the back of each screw, and so they don't fall out, a little bit of thread lock would be a good idea too. Once they're all fitted and nipped up, we've got a rather nice looking bit of complete chassis. I'm quite impressed by the general fit of everything still. It's quality stuff. Step 8 now, and since the parts bag covered 7 and 8, there's no bag to open. We need a few bits of plastic for this one. X6, the side bit, X2, the bottom bit, X3, the bit with the mounting lugs, X5, the bit that connects the bottom bits, and of course we'll need 2 of each to make up the tyre rack. As for the screws, we need pretty much everything that's left in the tub. 8 M2x10s, 3 M3x10s, 8 3x8 self-tappers, 8 M2 plain nuts, and 4 M3 flange nuts. We need to build up 2 of the end assemblies. There's 2 plastic bits, X2 and X3. X2 has 2 lugs with elongated holes. X3 has holes that line up with them. For fixing, we need 2 M2x10s, 1 in each hole. Because the holes don't line up perfectly, we need to use the screwdriver to spin the screw in, which just leaves the M2 nuts. To make sure it doesn't all fall apart, a little bit of thread lock goes a long way, just a little smear on the exposed threads, then loosen and retighten the screws into the nuts to spread it all around. They don't need to be super tight, just nice and snug, just so we've got a little bit of tension. Rinse and repeat with the other X2 and X3, so we've got 2 end assemblies ready to go. Next we've got the side bits, X6. Similar to the ends, the X6s have lugs with elongated holes that line up with the holes in the X3s. Also, like the end assemblies, they're held together with M2 screws and nuts. We don't want to do them up all that tight yet though, or Loctite them. First we need to fit the X5s on the bottom to pull everything together. The X5s get fitted with 3x8mm self-tappers. Nip them up and carefully align the parts so the strips along the bottom are straight where they meet. Now we can thread lock and tighten up all the M2 screws. We should end up with a fairly square assembly that's ready to fit to the chassis. But before we get to fit it, there's another bit, the rearmost cross member on the chassis. Seems like a strange place to have it in the build. Seems like it might have been better to fit it at the beginning with the others, or perhaps later with the bumper. Either way, it's easy to fit. We just line it up with the holes in the rear of the chassis and install the 4 remaining self-tappers. You can't fit it upside down or backwards due to the shape, which is rather neat. Okay, now we can fit the tyre rack. It slips over the chassis nicely and the holes line up fairly well, plenty good enough. To fit we need to use the M3x10s that are still left and 4 M3 flange nuts. For now I'm not going to thread lock them, as at some point it's all going to need painting, and that's a lot easier to do if we can still easily remove it. It's quite a nice looking structure. When painted black it will hide all the fixings and it should really look the part. I still need to find a supply of cheap wheels and tyres though, so we've actually got something to put in it. Step 9 next. We're getting a couple of bits ready for the next step. I think we'll get the plastic bits for the legs ready first. There's a few bits to find, B8 and B9 which are the outer cases, B5 the release lever, B3 the leg, and we need 2 B12s, the little plastic washers. Of course there's 2 legs, so we're going to need double everything. The other assembly is the mount for the kingpin, so we're going to need a metal coupler plate too. For the screws and bits we need to open up the bag for steps 9 and 10. There's a lot of good stuff in this one, a very nice collection of springs. For this step we're going to need all the springs out of the pot, we're going to need them for the legs. First though, we're going to put the kingpin together, so it's just out of the way. It's quite a neat little assembly. The kingpin is made up of 2 parts, an inner bit and a sleeve that's free to rotate, making for a nice bearing rather than rubbing the plastic parts of the track. To hold it on we need a long M3x18 countersunk screw and an M3 flange nut. Grab the kingpin and slide the sleeve over the end. There should be plenty of clearance allowing it to spin freely. There's an argument for using some grease too, being metal on metal parts. I'm thinking over its life dirty grease might cause more wear than having it dry. Through the top, pop the countersunk screw in the countersunk hole, pop the assembly into the just off centre hole in the middle of the plate, and from the back we'll need to install the M3 flange nut. It would be a good idea to use some Loctite too. The one thing I missed while building, I blame the time of night I recorded, the 4 holes in the corners are countersunk as well, and surprise surprise I put the kingpin on the wrong side. In my defence though, it's not all that clear in the manual. Once you get to fitting the plate it's easy enough to swap it round though. Okay, the fun bit now, the spring loaded legs. We need all the springs, the 2 3x15mm shafts, 6 2x6mm self-tappers, 2 M2x8 machine screws, and 6 2x8mm self-tappers. Okay, first we've got the 2 top plates to build. The release lever needs a bit of prep. There's a 2x6mm self-tapper that gets installed in the hole near the thin end. We only want to partially install it though. It's there to retain one of the springs, so we need a small gap between the screw head and the plastic. Next we need to position it to match up the plate with the diagram and partially insert the shaft. One side has a hole and the other side is blind, so you can't really get it wrong. Line up one of the scissor springs with the shaft and push the shaft in a little further so it holds the spring. Next, the release lever goes in next to the spring and the shaft can be pushed in the rest of the way so it sits flush. Then, while you've got hold of it all, the top of the spring needs to get popped under the screw in the lever. And there we go, one release lever installed. We're making pairs, so it's the same again for the other one. Now for the legs, we need the back bit where the legs slide up and down, and the leg itself. One of the problems I've read about with these kits is the legs are a bit stiff, so carefully check the sides for excessive lumps and bumps. Pop a coil spring down the end of the leg and hook the loop over the plastic boss. It's a bit of a fiddle, but it should stay put when you get it over. To stop it popping out, there's a small plastic washer and 2x6mm self-tapper. You don't need to do it up tight, you just need to bottom out the screw. Next, the leg slides into the back piece, and at this stage it is indeed rather stiff. However, all is not what it seems. The sides actually taper ever so slightly, so if we fit the top plate, it will spread the sides, giving the leg the clearance it needs to slide up and down freely. With that sorted, we can remove the plate again and pull the spring up and over the boss at the top of the back piece. And just like the other end, we need to fit one of the plastic washers and a 2x6mm self-tapper. It's a little bit stiff, but that's going to free up nicely when we get the lower screws fitted. Build up another one and we've got 2 assemblies ready to fit the last of the screws. On each one we've got 4 screws to fit. There's 3 self-tappers and 1 M2x6 cap head. It's got a square head, which is useful as it's positioned to stop the hinge pin for the release lever falling out. Install the cap head and self-tappers so they're just not quite bottomed out, then go round and nip them all up after. It just helps keep everything nice and square. And there we go, 2 retractable legs and a kingpin on an upside down plate. Very nice. Next week we might be fitting them to the chassis along with starting the body parts. Or if I make it down to Long Marston, we'll have some model show video. I think that will be the first model aero video of the year. So until then, thanks for watching, like if you liked, comment if you have a comment to make, or if you just want to say hi mum, and of course if you don't want to miss the next video, by all means subscribe. Bye guys.